November of 1999 was a pretty great time to be a Bond fan. Pierce Brosnan's third romp as the not-so-secret super spy dropped in theaters just in time for the holidays, and, well, what better way to celebrate the release of The World Is Not Enough than to have a Sony PlayStation exclusive tie-in of his previous adventure available to play at home. That's right, in November of '99, EA and Black Ops Entertainment would release Tomorrow Never Dies for the original Sony hardware. It was a pretty good time to be a Bond fan, indeed. Well, sorta. The World Is Not Enough is a pretty decent 007 action flick, despite the absurdity of Denise Richards' scientist character Christmas Jones. Yes, scientist Denise Richards. The Tomorrow Never Dies video game? Well, at the time, it was a massive disappointment for me. Massive being a bit of an understatement. For years, I considered this to be a bottom-of-the-barrel Bond game.
Don't tell.
EA had acquired the rights from Rare. The VHS tapes and highly priced DVDs were full of ads, pushing this thing so hard that I, the loyal fanatic I was, bought a copy day one. After the massive success of GoldenEye, this follow-up had to be good, right? I mean, that N64 game was revolutionary for console first-person shooters, so surely this new adventure donning the 007 moniker would try its hardest to recreate that magic. Well, how about no? Not at all. Black Ops Entertainment's first attempt at a Bond game is a bit of an ugly, janky, frustrating mess at times. That's how I used to see it back then, and at the time, I'd play anything that I invested my hard-earned money on. Good or bad, I would suffer through anything in order to milk every last penny out of my investment. To put it lightly, I couldn't even be bothered with this game after one playthrough. It has been sitting on my shelf for years. Occasionally I'd pick it up here and there to give it another go, only to get annoyed with the clunky controls and give up all over again. GoldenEye was a tight, responsive first-person shooter with a variety of objectives interspersed across a ton of intricately designed levels. It had multiple difficulty settings with new goals to achieve in each, as well as that memorable option to play 4-player local multiplayer straight out of the box. It was a massive, polished experience that is considered by many to be one of the best video games ever created. Now hey, look, it's unfair to compare Tomorrow Never Dies to GoldenEye. Many people have given this thing a poor review, merely stating that it isn't as good as Rareware's release. That's fine, I suppose, but it's also a flippant cop-out. I'm mentioning GoldenEye only to set up where the series was at the time when it came to video games. I also don't hold that N64 game in the precious place that many do, but that's a review for another time. The point is, Black Ops Entertainment attempted something new, and for that, I give them credit. It would have been easy to attempt another GoldenEye, and they didn't even try, so kudos to them. I'd argue that Tomorrow Never Dies feels more like a Bond game. It's definitely apparent that they tried to develop something a lot cleverer than a straight-up shooter, and I applaud them for that. Conceptually, it works, but it's a bit too ambitious, resulting in something that feels sloppy in execution. So let's shed any comparisons to GoldenEye from here on out, and judge this Tomorrow Never Dies game on its own merits. The first thing you're going to notice are the ugly, dated, low-res cutscenes stripped straight from the movie. When it comes to these, it's really hard to be too harsh a critic. This was just one of those unfortunate things that a lot of games did back then. It's one of the many reasons early disc-based games turned me off. From the years of the Sega CD all the way through this first polygonal console generation, I've just never been able to dig it. Some people can laugh at it and or appreciate it ironically, but I've always just found it hideously tacky. Fortunately, all of these scenes are skippable, so it's easy to just pretend that they don't exist. What I do enjoy are the horribly animated in-game character interactions. Now these are pure polygonal gold, baby.
I wondered what it would feel like if I ever saw you again.
Being able to see Brosnan's likeness from a third-person perspective is pretty great, in a clumsy sort of way, but the enemies all move around like spastic little coked-up acrobats. Yeah, it's fun at first, but trying to land a hit on these janky twits can be a bit frustrating, specifically when you're trying to hit them from a distance down sights. It sort of saps all of the fun out of sleuthing around, or attempting to traverse the stages with any sort of finesse when it's more efficient to just get up in a baddie's face, spraying and praying, dodging and rolling, and strafing with that fire button held down tight. Now, I've watched people skillfully headshot enemies from a distance, but in all of my years with this thing, I've never been able to be that reliably accurate. Maybe I just need to get good, but I think I can speak for the majority when I say that the aiming just doesn't feel great. The AI isn't particularly intelligent, but they are definitely mobile, and they have perfect vision. They also have near perfect aim, especially when they are looking down at you from a rooftop or a ledge. By the time I find out where these little bastards are and get my crosshairs trained, I'm normally dead. Aiming down sights doesn't necessarily guarantee anything either. Maybe there's a sweet spot that I'm not aware of, but killing an enemy from a distance has always been a crapshoot for me, let alone trying to land a headshot. Somehow, this game feels equally as loose and fidgety as it does stiff. Bond moves around with the swiftness of a tank, but the dodge rolls and lock-ons are extremely snappy, the latter being so quick in the third person that it can feel disorienting and a tad jarring. Aiming down the sights, particularly with sniper scopes, is excruciatingly slow, and the inability to move in this first-person mode outside of a bit of a horizontal peekaboo can be frustrating. This game also doesn't take advantage of analog controls, even though they had been around for nearly 2 years at this point, so it just never feels good. The camera itself is very responsive though. It reliably snaps behind the player and moves around quite well. When 007 is obstructed by something, he becomes translucent, which makes it easier to know exactly where he is at all times. This is pretty remarkable considering how frequently terrible the camera was in a lot of games at the time, but it doesn't solve the underlying issues, being that the environments are often jam-packed with boxes, refuse, and other obstacles. Most of the boxes can be destroyed, oftentimes for armor, health, and ammo, but clumsily bashing into stuff happens far too frequently. Personally, I've always had issues getting Bond close enough to things like switches and buttons. Hell, sometimes doors can even be a chore. I hate to belabor my point, but after a couple of decades, the controls still grate on my nerves. The L1 button puts Bond into a sleeker stealth pose, but it's rather jittery and unpredictable. While in this position, it's possible to roll, which is a great way to get in and out of cover, but when it comes to combat, I prefer to just strafe and shoot. It's all rather clumsy. To toss a positive onto this laundry pile of complaints, I will compliment the level geography. Many of the interiors look quite similar, but I infrequently get lost. This is quite a linear experience with relatively small areas to explore, but even when I felt like I was revisiting the same areas over and over, I was able to progress. Yeah, maybe that's a bit of a backhanded compliment, but I'm really trying to pick out the positives I experienced here. There are a few vehicular action set pieces that are definitely appreciated. The BMW 750iL controls well enough, but the driving sequence itself feels a bit rigid in execution on a linear stretch of road that feels far too claustrophobic to be any fun. When I'm in control of a Bond vehicle, I want to really open it up, with my finger on the accelerator trigger. Unfortunately, the best way to navigate through all of these obstacles in this sequence is to take things fairly slow and meticulously maneuver your way around them. Carefully blasting, reserving ammo, collecting health. It left a lot to be desired. It's very arcadey, which is good, but it could have been designed in a more forgiving way. Ideally, it would have been nice if the roadway was a lot wider, the pace much quicker, and the action more intense, but again, this was EA's first outing as a publisher for a Bond game, and it's nice to have the variety in here. Subsequent releases would improve on this formula exponentially in the hands of different, better developers. Speaking of hands, get a load of these mitts. So the car combat is decent but a bit underwhelming. Bond will also take to the slopes a few times in some rather finicky skiing sequences. These aren't offensively bad, but they're also not all that good either. Again, it's equal parts loose and stiff with an embarrassingly ineffective combat mechanic that is as clumsy in execution as it looks. The best way to complete these skiing challenges is to just ignore as many enemies as possible and beeline it for the goal. Black Ops Entertainment tried, and having Bond deploy his Union Jack parachute during a free fall a la The Spy Who Loved Me was a fun inclusion. If anything, it proves that their heart was in the right place. There were some Bond fans on that team, and I respect that.
Here's your new BMW 750. After that incident in Hamburg, I had to make a few refinements. She now has improved machine guns, heat-seeking rockets, and stronger armor.
I think we should get along quite well.
Gadgets are much more predominant here than any other 007 game up to this point, with a plethora of spy toys to play around with. Some of them are quite useful as well, with mission objectives that take advantage of doing things aside from simply running and gunning. One of my pet peeves when it comes to Bond games is that the majority of them focus way too much on straight up murdering a gazillion people, like a penguin suit wearing Rambo. Tomorrow Never Dies excels when it forces the player to do things like take a few reconnaissance photos or sleuth around. Unfortunately, these moments are too few and far between. I think it's important to note that this game largely predates many of the important 3D stealth titles such as Metal Gear Solid, Splinter Cell, and Hitman. As a result, it doesn't quite stick the landing when it comes to the subtle nuances of sneaking around, which is a shame because it does try to attempt it. I think it resembles Siphon Filter more than anything, which isn't inherently bad, but the lack of a truly great stealth mechanic makes it feel rather limited. Ambitious, but limited. One of my biggest disappointments with this Tomorrow Never Dies game is that it completely omits the fantastic motorcycle action set piece with Bond and Wei Lin from the movie. I'm not sure how they could have achieved this, but it's a shame nonetheless, as it's easily the most memorable sequence in the film for me. We do get an opportunity to play as Michelle Yeoh's Wei Lin in the game briefly, which is a nice addition, but yeah, it would have been really nice to have another late game vehicle break. Instead, we get about a half a dozen boss battles, so there's that. Basically, they are strafe fests. Kill them before they do you in, Tomb Raider style. Pop, pop, pop. Thank God for all of the toolboxes of health kicking around to mask the subpar gameplay. Hey, if your game isn't well balanced, throw more health pickups at the player. That always works, right? The sound effects are pretty authentic and decent, with some fairly good gun audio. Everything is a bit thin and tinny, but overall I think it captures the 90s Bond style with the gadgets sounding particularly crisp. Overall, I'd say that the voice work is pretty good as well, considering none of the actors from the film lent out their talents. It's really tough to hear the dialogue most of the time though, and M sounds like she's on Quaaludes.
007. International techno-terrorist Henry Gupta was spotted entering the Tomorrow printing press with a large secure briefcase.
But hey, the Bond guy, he's really trying.
White Rook, we have a problem. That jet is armed with Soviet SB-5 nuclear warheads. If the incoming cruise missile detonates those warheads, you're going to have a nuclear disaster.
Pretty damn good work across the board, with Adam Blackwood's Brosnan impression being the standout performance. As it should be.
Mr. Bond, still trying to write a happy ending? Too bad you're missing the key part of the story.
Speaking of story, this was initially intended to be a sequel to the film before it became a simple tie-in. Also, you will have to play the game on the higher difficulty to get the ending, which is one of those things that annoys me in any game. Yeah, Tomorrow Never Dies is short with a scant 10 stages that can be beaten in less than 4 hours, but still, playing on Agent gives you nothing, and the other option doesn't add any new objectives. A few of the music tracks are taken straight from the film, including Sheryl Crow's brittle, soulless white bread theme. Tommy Tallarico Studios handled the original in-game tracks, and well, some are better than others. This was the 90s, so everything needed to be varnished with attitude. The arrangements that work best are the subtle, quieter pieces. It's when the butt rock post-grunge phony baloney overdrive reverb-ridden electric guitar overpowers everything that things start sounding bad to me. Tallarico is a talented guy with many merits, but making guitars sound vapid, fake, and cheesy is kind of his MO. His sloppy college dorm room rendition of Monty Norman's Bond theme is particularly embarrassing and groan-worthy. The audio quality is good, but a few too many tracks lack cohesion. This isn't entirely his fault, though. Tallarico Studios merely attempted to ape the feel of the film, but I still think they went too far with the guitars and trashy techno sounds. I mean, they might have worked in the 90s, but the majority of the soundtrack sounds dated now, similarly to all of those copycat grunge bands that started to surface at the time. The melodic pieces work, but the bigger action themes lack memorable substance. Graphically, Tomorrow Never Dies is a bit of a mixed bag. At the time, I found it to be a pretty ugly game, but now I think I appreciate it a bit more. There are a lot of jagged polygons, but it's not really fair to hold that against it since that was par for the course at the time. Most of the stages look drab with a very limited dark color scheme, but there are a few areas that really pop. A lot of the snowy stages look nice and bright, allowing the details on the characters to really stand out. Unfortunately, the draw distance is pretty abysmal, making it tough to plan out a strategy ahead of time, since enemies will often pop in after they've already noticed you. A couple of the well-lit interior levels look decent, but the majority of them are shrouded in a bluish, dark hue. It seems that all of the environments that are closely related to the antagonist, Carver, are particularly muddy and uninspired. So yeah, I wouldn't say that the game is ugly, because there are some nice colorful stages here and there, but there are enough bad textures and poorly lit environments to prevent me from fully conceding that this thing looks consistently good. I'd say it's pretty average, with swaths of greatness, but ultimately the visuals are far too muddy for me. Revisiting Tomorrow Never Dies has been an interesting experience for me. Back in the day, I found it to be a sloppy, ugly mess of a game, but playing it again all of these years later, I find it to be mostly the same. It's not great, but I don't think it's downright terrible either. Perhaps I'm getting soft in my old age, but I really did start to appreciate the work Black Ops Entertainment invested into attempting to create a new Bond experience. Attempting being the operative word. Some people might be turned off that there isn't a multiplayer option, but I'm okay with it. I'm never disappointed by the lack of multiplayer in any game, but apparently there was one planned, as it can be found in debug mode. Judging by the controls, it probably wouldn't have been that great anyway, so maybe it was best left on the cutting room floor. I'm not sure if I'd recommend Tomorrow Never Dies. It's still extremely inexpensive at the time of this video, which I know firsthand since I had to buy another copy for like $3 online, since my original disc wouldn't work. I guess it's worth trying if this footage looks at all interesting to you. At the end of the day, I'm happy I gave it yet another shot, and well, as I said, I like it more now than I ever did, so there's that. Next time, another Bond game. We're doing a bit of a 007 thing here on this channel to try and draw some attention to our new podcast, entitled Bondin' Over Beers, where we casually, chronologically take a look at each and every Bond flick, so check it out wherever you get yours. Subscribe and tune in for more 007 content here as well. Tomorrow Never Dies, a better Bond game than I initially thought. Still, not one of the best, but certainly better than the majority of the Activision ones. Hey, at least this one has a bit of heart.